Dr. Christopher Coyne is an associate professor of economics at George Mason University and the associate director of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center. He also serves as the director of graduate studies for the Department of Economics. He serves as the co-editor for the Review of Austrian Economics, the co-editor of the Independent Review, the co-editor of the Advances in Austrian Economics, and the book review editor of Public Choice. His primary areas of research include Austrian economics, economic development, and political economy. Professor Coyne is the author of several books, including After War, The Political Economy of Exporting Democracy, Media, Development, and Institutional Change, and the editor of the Handbook on the Political Economy of War. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Christopher Coyne.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Well, thank you all very much for taking the time to come, and to everyone that participated in organizing this. It's been a pleasure to be here and to get to meet many of you. And so what I'm going to be talking about tonight is this notion of foreign intervention. I'm going to make it very U.S.-centric. So I'm going to be focused on the U.S. government's efforts to intervene in other countries to bring about a variety of different ends, which I'll specify in a moment. And since it's Adam Smith Week, I thought I'd link in and motivate this with Adam Smith. The nice thing about Adam Smith, of course, is because he wrote 2 very large books, you can pretty much find anything in them to link things up with. And so let me get right into this so we can move along. And since when I talk about foreign intervention, what I'm talking about is the use of power by one government. As I mentioned, I'm going to be primarily focused on the U.S. government since it is the dominant world power that intervenes all around the world on a continual basis and has been since at least World War II, if not prior. It is the use of the discretionary power by the political elite to achieve a desired end in another society that otherwise would not come about. Because, of course, if it would come about absent the intervention, you wouldn't need it in the first place. I have a very broad notion of this. So my notion of foreign intervention is going to include things like military occupation. It's going to include things like foreign aid. It's going to include things like humanitarian interaction or humanitarian action, broadly understood, which typically involves some combination of aid, the military, development experts, and so on. And so I want to keep this broad on purpose. And so let's go to Adam Smith. Adam Smith, among other things, in The Wealth of Nations, talks about the British Empire and the English colonies. And he's extremely skeptical of the English colonies. And he raises several arguments that he views as pointing out the limitations of the imperialism of his government. And the first one that he touches upon in Chapter 7 of The Wealth of Nations, in Book 4, is really an extension of mercantilism. And one of the arguments for the British Empire for foreign intervention was that it would create new markets for the merchants, for British merchants. So by colonizing other areas, other societies, geographic areas, it would create new markets. And on top of that, the merchants, British merchants, could establish monopoly power over those areas. So they'd have a guaranteed contained market that moved beyond Britain proper. In the next chapter, Smith expands upon this point. And he says, look, here's the problem with this. It is true that by doing this you grant some benefits to the merchants. But who foots the bill for these imperialistic adventures and for the maintenance of these colonies? Well, it is British citizens. They are the ones that have to pay the bills associated with this. So really what you get is benefits that are concentrated on the merchants, but the costs are dispersed amongst all citizens. What today you and I would call the logic of concentrated benefits, dispersed costs, or special interest groups. So Smith had a keen understanding of what today we refer to as public choice theory and the role that public choice theory played in foreign intervention. But he goes beyond that. And Smith also has a very keen understanding of the incentives facing politicians. And he says, look, imperialism is costly. But here's the thing, politicians, the political elite, don't want to anger citizens. So what they try to do is they try to engage in trickery. And one of the forms of trickery they engage in is budget manipulation, fiscal manipulation. And instead of raising taxes, what they're going to do is tend towards issuing debt and other tricks what Smith later refers to as a juggling trick, to mask the true costs of intervention in order to placate citizens and make them believe, wrongly, that the activist foreign policy is costing less than it actually does in practice. So Smith not only has an understanding of special interest groups, but also the incentives facing politicians. Now let's go reverse, because the theory of moral sentiments came out before the Wealth of Nations. And the theory of moral sentiments, to my knowledge, Smith doesn't talk explicitly about imperialism and colonization. But he does have a wonderful understanding of the mentality that is associated with government bureaucrats. And he has this notion of what he calls the man of the system. And the man of the system, according to Smith, is this very arrogant, conceited bureaucrat who has this grand plan for how the world should look. And the man of the system is so confident in their grand plan that they think that they can just move people around, as Smith says, as if they are pawns on a chessboard. That is, as if they can arrange pieces in the world to align with their grand plan. And the pawns, just like on a chessboard, don't respond. They are passive actors. Keep this in mind, because I'm going to come back to it in a moment. It's a broad mentality or way of thinking. But what I want to suggest is that the combination of these three insights goes a long way in explaining the limits of foreign intervention. So this is what I want to focus on for the remainder of my time and how I'm going to frame this. And it's a very powerful framework. For those of you who, of course, have taken any economics, this is really just microeconomics in some sense. We're going to focus on the incentives, especially as they pertain to political actors. Of course, the state, in its raw form, is the monopoly on force. When we talk about foreign interventions, it is the state that carries out foreign interventions. You and I don't carry out foreign interventions. The government that supposedly represents us does, on our behalf, supposedly. But we want to take into account the incentives they face, as Smith highlights and emphasizes. Likewise, we want to focus on the epistemic or knowledge constraints. That is, we want to focus on the type of knowledge that is required to achieve the ends of foreign interventions. And we want to ask ourselves, do the people who are proponents of foreign intervention actually possess the requisite knowledge to achieve the end that they state they want to achieve? And so we have a dual set of concepts here. Do they possess the relevant knowledge, and do they possess the relevant incentive to act on that knowledge? And so we can think about these things. We can think about the required knowledge. We can think about the mindset that is required for intervention to be carried out. And it will lead us to a very powerful conclusion, one of skepticism towards foreign intervention, which is where I'm going to end up. Now, most treatments of foreign intervention today, in the popular press, among politicians, completely downplay the things that I just highlighted. In other words, there's rarely any discussion of constraints on human reason, that is, what can we design and what can't we design, and the incentives at work. Instead, you typically get things like this. This is then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton talking to the Council on Foreign Relations. And she says, look, we can do whatever we want. We're America. In other words, we, the United States government, is completely unconstrained in what we can accomplish. Now, you might say, well, this is just political talk. But what I want to suggest is it's not political talk. It is actually the mindset that people possess in the U.S. government when it comes to foreign intervention, when it comes to intervening abroad, when it comes to using scarce monetary resources, physical resources, but most importantly, humans, that is our fellow citizens, to intervene in other societies, which also consist of human beings. In other words, this mentality, I would suggest, is one of many illustrations of Smith's man of the system. That is the view that the world is a science project or chessboard that can be rearranged according to the grand designs of those who are in charge and who are enlightened. So let me just give 5 realities of foreign policy using Smith's framework as a springboard. And then I'm going to come back and talk about what I call the interventionist mindset. There's other realities as well, but these are the ones I want to focus on given our time limitations, but I also think they're the most powerful things to think about. Number 1, the gap between intentions and results. One of the core insights of economics, broadly understood, so beyond foreign intervention, is that wishing something so does not make it so. We can imagine many different states of the world that we would wish to come about. but that doesn't mean they can come about. Why? Because of constraints, because of incentives. So simply coming up with a grand plan that sounds good does not mean that we can achieve that. In fact, one of the key insights from economics is the idea that the best laid plans oftentimes not only fail, but generate an array of perverse unintended consequences which actually do more harm than good. Let me give you an example of this, a living example of this. Gaddafi, terrible authoritarian despot. Of course, he was an ally of the US government not too long before they helped overthrow him, but we'll put that aside for a moment. We can all agree that when it comes to human rights, to how he treated his citizens, he was terrible. So what was the solution? Overthrow him. It sounds very straightforward. It got even better than that. You'll recall that President Obama didn't want to get bogged down in similar foreign adventures that the Bush administration had gotten bogged down in, namely Iraq and Afghanistan. So he committed to not putting boots on the ground. So you'll recall that what the United States did in the case of Libya was to contribute to enforcing a no-fly zone in order to protect the rebels on the ground, which then were able to successfully overthrow the Gaddafi regime. And eventually, of course, he was killed. Gaddafi, that is. At the time this happened, okay, so this is 2011, everyone who had designed and carried out the intervention was patting themselves on the back. They said, this is the new way to do foreign intervention. No boots on the ground, no lives lost, the lightest of light footprint approaches. This is the way we're going to carry out humanitarian intervention going forward. But what was the question that no one seemed to ask? What happens the day after you overthrow a government? Does a constitutional republic magically fall from the sky? Do people just put down their guns and all of a sudden start cooperating with each other? And the answer is, of course not. And of course, we don't have to speculate about what's happened. We can just go to another headline, which is this. So now, of course, we hear calls of what? Well, the United States government needs to send weapons and potentially troops back to combat ISIS, because now ISIS poses a severe threat to the United States and its interests. By overthrowing Gaddafi, which seemed like a very obvious thing to do, the United States unleashed a series, I should say the United States government, you and I had nothing to do with it, unleashed a series of negative unintended consequences which have imposed severe humanitarian costs on innocent people that has led to a civil war and has created an environment conducive to a brutal terrorist organization. And of course, this doesn't even get into the variety of unintended consequences in Iraq and Afghanistan. This doesn't even, of course, go back and look at past interventions, like, of course, the US intervention in the Soviet Afghanistan war in the late 70s that led to the creation of Al-Qaeda in the first place, or the CIA's sponsored coup in Iran in the mid-50s that led to the current issues in Iran today, which is another thing that the US government likes to talk about as being a major national threat, and so on down the line. You get my point. What appears obvious, what appears as things we need to do, right, which is a common thing you hear. We need to do this because if we don't, what's going to happen? Well, will you endorse an intervention if it generates severe harms? Would you have supported the overthrow of Gaddafi if I told you it was going to lead to an environment where ISIS could thrive? Maybe you would. Maybe you take that trade-off, but you can understand the point that at least that's something we need to consider. In other words, considering Econ 101, the fact that there are unintended consequences, the fact that we can't predict the future with certainty when we talk about complex systems, the fact that people face incentives on the ground, and when there are power vacuums, those who are the most powerful are going to tend to seize power, and that oftentimes tends to be the most brutal thugs because they are unconstrained. There's a lack of constraints on what they can do. So those who are best able to seize power will tend to do so. You can see how these things will emerge and how economics provides a means for at least asking these questions and thinking about them. Number two, reliance on top-down planning. You know, it's amazing. Peter and I were talking about this earlier. It's a point that he brought up. You know, it's very odd when it comes to foreign policy, when we think about the US political landscape. On the one hand, you have those on the right, Republicans. And Republicans purport, or pretend, I should say, to be against big government. So if you ask a lot of Republicans, they'll say, well, government shouldn't be involved in education, they shouldn't be involved in healthcare, and so on down the list. But it comes to foreign intervention, which is government at its largest, government at its most unconstrained, and they will wholeheartedly endorse it. Not just endorse it, but if you go against it, somehow you are against America. There's a tension there. Those on the left, they pretend to be against foreign intervention, except for purely humanitarian purposes. They also pretend to want to not reward big corporations, cronyism. Yet they oftentimes support intervention as well. In fact, you would be hard-pressed to find a candidate right now that is truly non-interventionist. Now, you see some non-interventionist language going on, but not really when you actually dig into it. But who benefits from the US government's proactive foreign policy? I would suggest the largest beneficiary are corporations. Those that are politically connected and are able to reap the benefits of the close to $1 trillion that the United States spends annually on defense-related matters. This is just Smith's insight about special interest groups. You rely on a massive government apparatus to carry out an activity, it is going to attract cronies. It is going to attract people out of the woodwork, like bees are attracted to honey, and is going to attract people who are best able to feather their own nest at the expense of taxpayers, just like the British merchants were. This is not surprising or shocking if you understand economics, but it is something that is not discussed. But the other issue is that we don't know how to design the world. This is the ambassador, the US ambassador to Haiti, all right? And this is him talking after the brutal Haitian, the earthquake in Haiti in 2010. And again, every once in a while, politicians speak the truth. And when they do, it's very clear where they stand on things. So just think about this. And he says, look, there is a silver lining to the disaster in Haiti. We, again, this mysterious we, can put it back together the way we've always wanted. If that is not Adam Smith's man of the system, I don't know what is. There's Haiti, the it, not people, not individuals and human beings, but it, and there's we, the enlightened ones, and we can put them back together the way that they want to, that we want to, according to our grand plan. That, by the way, the US and other governments have been attempting to implement for decades and failing repeatedly. But this time we're going to get it right. Magically. That's the type of mentality I'm talking about. You know, the fundamental issue here is one of a knowledge problem, but there's a knowledge problem on two levels. The first is that, contrary to the way people talk, social scientists, and I use that term broadly, I use it to include economists, I use it to include political scientists, sociologists, and so on. Despite what people pretend, no one knows how to plan and design an economy from scratch. That goes for the economists. For the political scientists, no one knows how to sit down and design a constitution that actually operates as if society is a blank slate, and you can just drop it wherever you want and it's going to achieve the desired end. We know the underlying factors that constitute a free society, but we don't know, as social scientists, the correct way to go about doing it or establishing it, because it's not established. It's not like a blueprint that you just get. It's not like a Lego set or an IKEA piece of furniture, which itself is quite complicated, by the way. But in any case, you get the point. On top of that, there's a more fundamental issue of intra-institutional, that is within institutions. One of the key insights of Ludwig von Mises and F.A. Hayek, who are two economists, very well-known economists, was that you cannot centrally plan economic development. These two individuals were involved in something, a history of thought episode called the Socialist Calculation Debate, or in the early 1900s into about the 1940s. And really what the debate was about is, what is the best way of organizing economic activity? On the one hand, you had the socialists, not meant in a derogatory way that the way people use the term today, but they argued that you could rationalize economic production by ridding the world of private property, getting a group of very intelligent people in a room, and determining what is to be produced. So they can tell you what to produce and the cost minimizing way to produce it. And in doing so, you would outproduce capitalism. This was their claim. And at the same time, you would overcome all of the ills and the black blemishes and the dark side of capitalism, inequality, business cycles, market failures, and so on. Mises and Hayek said, well, wait a second. How do you know what to produce? How do you know how to produce it? That information is not predetermined and given. In stark contrast, that information is discovered. It emerges through the market process. That is, under a regime of private property rights, which the socialists wanted to abolish, individuals have conjectures. That is, they have ideas about different alternative courses of action. In other words, how to use scarce resources, and they bet on those conjectures. They have to pay market prices in order to bid the resources away from other uses, and they subject it to the market test, profit and loss. That system, that complex system, serves as a source of feedback. And it tells entrepreneurs or economic actors whether they are doing the correct thing. And by doing the correct thing, I mean it alerts them and provides feedback as to whether they are using scarce resources in a manner that you and I as consumers value. Absent that feedback, those feedback mechanisms, absent prices and profit and loss, which are grounded in private property rights, Mises and Hayek argued, turns out correctly, there is no way for planners to know what to produce. There's no way. They wouldn't know what to produce. And they wouldn't know how to produce it. They could produce stuff, and they did. Soviet Union produced lots of stuff. Tanks, bombs, dams, and other infrastructure. But there's a reason people were waiting in line for hours to obtain basic foodstuffs like bread and other things that you and I take for granted, that you and I have access to on a daily and regular basis because we are fortunate enough to live in a society that allows markets to operate, at least to some degree. So there's no way to plan development. Now think about this. How do most economists talk about economic development? We're the wealthy ones. They're the poor ones, so the development experts are going to tell the poor societies how to develop. They're going to give them foreign aid, they're going to give them guidance, and they're going to tell them how to spend it. I would like to suggest that development economics, in its modern iteration, that is in its post-World War II iteration, is much closer to central planning, much closer to socialism than it is to the market economy that development economists pretend to endorse and like, and try to push other governments to adopt. And so you have this dual knowledge problem. Number 3, a complete ignorance of historical context. Going back to Smith's chessboard, the man of the system, the interventionist, believes they can intervene in other societies and just move things around, and people are just going to do what they want. They have very little care, if any whatsoever, for the fact that the people in those societies have historical experiences, they have beliefs, they have traditions, they have various forms of organization through which they live their lives. These things are all irrelevant for the interventionist. I already gave you one example of this in the way that the Obama administration framed the intervention in Libya. But let me give you another very clear example of this. General Stanley McChrystal, who of course headed up the Afghan troops for a number of years. And he admitted it. So again, it's to the Council of Foreign Relations. He said, yeah, we didn't really pay attention to what the history of Afghanistan was. Now, you understand the point here, hopefully. And this links up with the point I was just making about the knowledge problem. Think about it like this. What if I said to you, look, why did we go into Iraq and Afghanistan? I'm from Northern Virginia. Why didn't the US government hire me as a consultant? They could pay me lots of money. Send me into Washington, D.C. to one of the museums. Send me to the museum shop. We could splurge for $15 and buy a copy of the US Constitution on nice parchment paper. And we could have rolled it up and mailed it over to Iraq. And said, look, it worked well here for about 5 years. Just follow these rules. And you too will have a constitutionally constrained government. And the answer, of course, is because it wouldn't have worked. Because the underlying beliefs, dispositions, and historical experiences which make constitutions operate where they do, which is quite rare throughout history, by the way, them operating correctly, is such that you just can't drop rules down wherever you want to. But people don't even care. How arrogant is this? I mean, think about this for a second, right? I am going to intervene in another society, and I'm not going to bother to look at Wikipedia or to read a book. That should be a stopping argument, or at least strong skepticism going forward. By the way, McChrystal, now he's retired, is a consultant in Alexandria, Virginia, which consults on government on how to intervene in other countries. Reliance on politics. Foreign intervention is all about politics because politicians carry it out, which means it is fundamentally an issue of political economy. That is, the application of the economic way of thinking, incentives and constraints to politics. Again, we have Smith as a guide. He talked about special interest groups. He talked about the fact that politicians are going to manipulate things to make themselves look better and to make the war efforts look better than they do because they don't want citizens to realize the true costs of them. So what type of things happen in government? I don't know. Let's think about some things we experience in our daily life. Let's say the DMV, Amtrak, the TSA, the US Postal Service. These are all government bureaucracies. Now imagine giving the US Postal Service guns. Oh wait, don't do that. No. Imagine if you simply armed, right, people in one of these bureaucracies. Right, which is the same form. It's a difference. The difference between the military and the postal office is one of degree and not in kind. Now, for the military people in the room, do not get upset. I realize there's a difference between them. My point is that there's not a difference in terms of organizational form, meaning they are both government bureaus. A government bureau has certain general characteristics which creates incentives and influences how people act. Let's think about some of them. Number one, they are nonprofits by definition, which means they are not subjected to the profit and loss mechanism, which I discussed earlier. Absent that, what kind of feedback do they rely on to determine if they are successful or not? They rely on output measures, that is how much is produced or how many resources are spent at a point in time, and they rely on the number of people working in the bureau, that is how much they can grow their bureaucracy. That is the sign of success. That is how you get power and currency in a bureau that is a nonprofit. What else do you get? Well, you're going to get a lot of political competition. You're going to get a lot of competition between the special interests that Smith warned against. You're going to get a lot of competition between the various government agencies involved in foreign intervention, as each of them seeks to get their hand in the pot to secure as much as possible such that they can expand their budget, such that they can hire more people that are working for them, and so on. So what happens? I don't know. Let's look again, for anyone who actually cares to look. Iraq and Afghanistan, massive amounts of waste with no one responsible. We're all responsible, right? Because it's all of us. It's like, no, that's not the case. Someone has to make a decision. Who's ultimately responsible for the fact that there are billions of dollars that cannot be accounted for? That money is simply lost. Literally can't be accounted for. That in many cases money ended up in the hands of the very people that have been identified as enemies of the members of the US military. I want you to keep this in mind. The US government sent US troops abroad, US citizens, and then in numerous instances, money, weapons, and supplies ended up in the hands of the enemies of the very people that the US citizens are combating. That should make you quite concerned. That should be reason for worry. What else? Haiti. Billions of dollars just dumped in the wake of it. Because we had Ambassador Luck tell us, now's our chance to put it back together the way we've always wanted to. We're not constrained. We can do whatever we want. We just need more money. And it's story after story of this. You know, a while back, I started collecting headlines from Iraq and Afghanistan of US military contractors who were engaged in corruption, fraud, and waste. But I got tired because it's like a full-time job. Because there's so many headlines on a constant basis where people just steal money. Because you just dump in billions of dollars and there's very little to no accountability. I mean, there's no accountability in the Department of Defense anyway. They haven't been audited ever. They're in violation of federal law, which requires them to be audited. They're the only ones that have, only main agency that's not been audited. Number 5, the rejection of complex phenomena. You know, Smith had this great idea, which is how most of you know of him, which is this idea of the invisible hand. Now, the invisible hand's kind of gotten blown out of proportion. Smith only uses the term twice, once in the theory of moral sentiments and once in the wealth of nations. But it's oftentimes the idea that is most associated with Smith. Really what Smith was getting at with this idea of the invisible hand is that the economic system, the economy, is so complex that we need to figure out how to coordinate somehow. The invisible hand is simply referring in the broadest sense to the underlying processes that facilitate social cooperation, that allow us to figure out how to utilize scarce resources. So Smith has all these interesting thought experiments. He says, look, on the back of the average day laborer, there's a wool coat, just an ordinary wool coat. And he says, but when you step back and think about it, how many people are involved in making that wool coat? Man, there's a lot of people involved. And there's lots of different resources that need to be combined across geographic space. That's pretty amazing. Let's think about how that gets made. And then he starts exploring that. And he says, you know, there's all these forces that coordinate people without any central planner telling them what to do. That at its core is what the invisible hand is all about. What Smith was emphasizing, and that his fellow Scottish Enlightenment thinkers, David Hume, Adam Ferguson, and so on, what they emphasized is that much of society, much of the world in which you and I live, consists of complex phenomena. So we can differentiate a complex system from a simple system. A simple system is a linear system. It's an engineering problem. It doesn't mean it's simple that anyone can do it, but we can utilize human reason to solve the problem. An engineer designed this building. We can be fairly confident that it is going to stand up, that it won't fall over. It's a very complex problem, meaning it's hard. Not any of us could just sit down and do it. You need a special set of skills. But it is one that can be conquered using human reason. It's a problem that can be solved. A complex system, in contrast, is one where there are interrelated units, and those interrelated units interact on each other in ways that cannot be predicted with certainty. That is, interventions or interjections into one part of the system have a chain of unintended consequences, oftentimes negative, that you can't predict. You know, it's not just the economy that's a complex system. Ecosystems are complex systems. I'm sure many of you have heard of scenarios where some foreign species is introduced into an ecosystem, either purposefully or by accident, and it has devastating effects. That's an example of a complex system. So the economy is a complex system. Historical experiences, the variety of norms that you and I take for granted and don't even think about on a daily basis, are a complex system. They are the result of historical experience and traditions that we're all born into. They are things that we just act upon. When you meet someone, you tend to shake their hand. We hold the door for people. We have norms of politeness and social cooperation and interaction with people. You don't have to follow them. I could meet you. You could stick your hand out and then give me the fake out. You couldn't get arrested for that, but it would be considered rude. We have a whole host of norms, informal rules that facilitate social cooperation. All of these things are a complex system. So what happens when you try to impose a simple system on a complex system? You get really messed up outcomes. What's a common example of this? How many of you in this room have heard a politician say something like this? We sent a man to the moon, therefore we can do X. That is exactly this point. Typically, if you actually listen, they follow it up with the X is a complex system. We sent a man to the moon, therefore we can rebuild Iraq. No, not unless the goal is to launch a spaceship from Iraq. Because I've read all the documents on Iraq. Nowhere in there does it say we're going to launch a spaceship. It is rebuild the society. But don't take my word for it. Let's actually look at it. This is from the Stability Operations Manual of the U.S. Army. All right? The poor members of the military, I feel terrible for them. The U.S. government sends them into a conflict zone and says, hey, build an economy while there's bullets flying around. And here, it's 5 simple steps. Just build some infrastructure. I wonder if anyone noticed the irony of the 5-step plan, by the way. But in any case, reconstruct the infrastructure. Build a viable workforce. Just manage the natural resources. Build the stock market and capital markets. Get rid of black markets, and there you go. And notice how it's laid out, as if it's a linear step, one to the next. You want democracy? Just get some civil participation, get a free media, and so on. You get the point. This is the way that people think about the world. And then they task the poor members of the military with carrying this out. It would be the equivalent of imagine everyone goes home from a corporate complex. Let's pick Microsoft, all right? And unfortunately, there's a fire. So no one dies, it burns down. And they call the fire department in. So we're in America here, there's no conflict going on. And the fire department comes. Right, they're putting out the fire. And the CEO of Microsoft goes, hey guys, thanks for putting out that fire. While you're doing it, can you take a look at my HR policies and tell me if those are good? And can you resolve those supply chain issues that we're having? And can you renegotiate our contracts to get us a better deal? The fireman would say, like, what are you doing? I'm trying to put out a fire. That's my comparative advantage. I don't have any kind of skill in this. I can't do it. Not only do we task members of our own military with doing that, but we actually put them in the middle of conflict and ask them to do that. I would like to suggest that is patently absurd. It is a recipe for failure. It is asking people to be social engineers in a way that even the most intelligent economist or political scientist can't do. Even under the most idealized conditions of actually having no conflict going on and having a peaceful society. But you add that element in, and it's literally a recipe for disaster. Example number 2. This is an actual declassified PowerPoint presentation of one of the plans that was discussed for Afghanistan. Now I want you to just take this in for a second. All right? Someone in the US government said, you know what we need? A PowerPoint presentation. So, it doesn't stop there, ladies and gentlemen. We need a PowerPoint presentation that captures in 22 slides the entire country of Afghanistan. So, let's go hire someone with PowerPoint skills. That's typically an MBA from an Ivy League school. Probably paid them lots of money. And they said, look, put it all on one slide. You can get this online. It starts like with these 2 boxes. And then before you know it, about 22 slides later, there you go. There's a plan for Afghanistan. Now, how is it that whoever put this up wasn't laughed out of the room? Maybe they were. I don't know. I wasn't there. I doubt it. And you say, look, no, Chris, what are you talking about? You said culture's important. They have the word beliefs there. So they take it seriously. No, that misses the point. In fact, it supports my point, which is even when people pay attention to what I'm talking about, when they say, look, historical context matters. For them, mattering means putting the words down. And then it means drawing arrows if that means something, that you actually can base policy on this. I want you to keep in mind what's at stake here. Human beings. That is, US troops sent into other people's society. Some of them are bad people. Many of them are not. Yet the plan is that you can just impose whatever you want on other people, just based on PowerPoint. So that's the realities of it. If that hasn't made you skeptical enough, let's think about the mindset that is required for foreign intervention. And let me step back for a moment and just reiterate what's at the core of foreign intervention. I mentioned this earlier, but it's important to reiterate. Foreign intervention entails one government, using force to impose its vision, either force or the threat of force, on another society. So what type of mentality does that require? What type of mindset? Smith offered some insight into that. It's going to require the man of the system type mentality, but with a sympathy towards violence, towards the use of force against other people. What I want to suggest is that foreign intervention at its very core is authoritarian, and it is paternalistic. That is, it fundamentally cuts against the core values of what people purport to be American values. It is authoritarian because it assumes that we, again, that mysterious we, which is really the political elite, have the power to design a simplified and concise solution and impose it on other people. And it's paternalistic because it is telling other people how they should live their lives. So you have authoritarian paternalism. Now, what are the characteristics of this? I think we can distill it down into 10 of them. And some they overlap, and they relate to what I talked about. But let's just spend a few moments talking about them. Number 1, the interventionist, the proponent of intervention, is extremely confident, bordering on outright arrogant and obnoxious, about their ability to design entire societies. I want you to think about the mentality of the people that put those 2 images together. Imagine having the gall to do that. For you to sit down and think that you can plot out Afghanistan on a PowerPoint slide. What type of reasoning does that require? What type of confidence does that require? Related, possesses a sense of superiority. I know better than others. I know better how the world should look than other individuals know, human beings. Number 3 is very comfortable condemning the preferences, that is, the choices that other people make. You know, it's quite odd. When people look at other societies, and this doesn't just mean military intervention, development economists do this all the time. They never think to themselves, maybe people like living the way they're living. Just like I like living the way I live. Like imagine someone just showed up at your door. Well, you don't have to imagine now in America, it's starting to happen. In any case, let's pretend for a minute we had to imagine it. And someone showed up at your door and said, you know what, I don't like the way you're living right now. You have to change your behavior because I tell you. How would you feel about that? I imagine you wouldn't like it. So how do you think other human beings feel about that? Do you think they like it? You have to if you're a proponent of interventionism. Feels comfortable imposing their preferences on others. Not only do they make judgments about other people's preferences, but they feel comfortable imposing their preferences at the threat of gunpoint when necessary. Number 5 is extremely confident in a massive public-private bureaucracy to carry out their grand vision. This goes back to what I was saying earlier. There is no larger bureaucratic apparatus than the military-industrial complex. It puts Obamacare to shame. It puts any other private-public partnership that you can think of to shame. Yet people are quite comfortable wielding this and endorsing this complex in the name of national security and defense, without any care for the fact of what happens when you allow this type of thing to happen. When you grant significant powers to members of government over private affairs, over private economic activity. Number 6, lacks sympathy towards foreigners. You know, I'm sure you've heard presidents, you can find President Bush say this, you can find President Obama say this. They'll say things like, we gave Afghanistan and Iraq the chance to be free. We gave them a chance to be a democracy. How arrogant is that? No one ever seems to think, maybe they don't want what we have to offer. So, when the gracious gift of occupation is rejected, the interventionist thinks those people are ungrateful. They're ungrateful for the gift I am bestowing upon them. Never stepping back to think that maybe they do not perceive it as a gift. Maybe they perceive it as the exact opposite, as a threat, as force being used to impose a way of life upon them that they don't want. Even if you and I, or the experts, think that it's silly, the way they live. Number 7, excludes the costs imposed upon those being intervened upon. I'm sure many of you, to the extent you pay attention, have heard many people in the United States government talk about the 4,500 to 5,000 soldiers that have died in Iraq and Afghanistan. And rightfully so, those are human lives. And they'll talk about how they died doing their duty to their country and protecting the freedoms and liberties that you and I oftentimes take for granted. Again, as they should. Very rarely do you hear them talk about the 150 to 500,000 Iraqis that have been killed. I give you that range because I don't know what the exact number is, because the US government refuses to count and keep track of it. Why? Because who cares about the Iraqis? They're not important. But they're human beings. So that kind of seems to be important if you care about human beings. Unless you don't care about them because they were born in or live in a certain geographic region. That is, if you want to stereotype a group of people based on their geographic region and then say, yeah, whatever. They're not equivalent, right? We don't need to count them. But think about what the implications are for that. Think about what the implications are for that for those of us who purport to believe in liberty and freedom and individualism, supposedly the foundations of our own country. Number 8, understates the monetary costs of intervention on domestic populace. This is Smith predicted. How many people or anyone in this room remember what the original estimate in Iraq was from the George W. Bush administration? No, I'm talking about the original stated estimate. That's the actual, close to the actual cost. $50 billion. Remember, $50 billion, oil's going to pay for it, greed as liberators, in and out. That was the Bush, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz line. Now, $1.5 to $3 trillion. That's the estimate, including all the long-term health care costs for troops, all the costs of replenishing equipment that has depreciated or been destroyed, and so on. Anyone ever step back and wonder who's going to pay for that? Where that's going to come from, the money? I don't know, your grandkids perhaps? Seems like that's an important thing we want to discuss and think about. It's a general rule of thumb, by the way. Anytime any politician from any political party opens their mouth and puts a dollar amount on it, multiply it somewhere in the range of 5 to 10. And that's probably a better estimate of how much it's going to end up costing compared to what it actually turns out costing, because of the incentives that Smith talked about. Number 9, lacks the ability to self-reflect. You know, we're all human beings, and we're all imperfect, and we make mistakes all the time. Part of being a successful human being is being self-aware of your weaknesses and being able to self-reflect. And it's true that other people can mess up, but you and I can mess up too. And we need to be aware of that and say, you know, I messed up. If I change my behavior going forward, and I recognize the constraints that I face, the things that I can and cannot achieve, I'll be able to better achieve my goals. If you listen to members of the US government, they never say, wait, maybe we can't do this. Maybe we can't occupy and rebuild countries. They just say, look, we didn't have enough resources. If Obama hadn't ended the surge, magically it would have been different. If X, Y, and Z didn't happen, typically very simplified things, and they blame the other political party. If they had done that, things would have been different. They never step back to point out the fact that they can't do what they say they can do. They're setting themselves up for failure repeatedly, and more importantly, the members of the military. More importantly, it ignores the non-monetary costs. You know, war, as Tocqueville pointed out in Democracy in America, war wreaks havoc on domestic freedoms and liberties. It destroys the civil liberties and freedoms of citizens in the intervening country. That is a cost of war. That is something that you and I experience on a daily basis. That's the NSA. That is the militarization of police. That is the use of drones domestically to surveil our private lives, and so on down the line. Many American citizens are way too passive. They're way too willing to give up these rights and liberties without a care in the world in the name of false sense of security, which never seems to happen. It never seems to actually come about. The perpetual war for perpetual peace that politicians on both sides preach repeatedly never seems to end. It just continues on and on. So why does this matter? Well, it ignores all of Smith's concerns. It ignores the epistemic or knowledge constraints. It ignores the incentives at work. But more importantly, the interventionist mindset is fundamentally at odds with the values of a liberal society. And I don't mean liberal in the modern sense, I mean it in the traditional sense. Classical liberalism. That is a restricted government whose job is to serve citizens. Not for citizens to serve the government, not for government to surveil private citizens because they are assumed to be threats and suspects, but instead a government that is limited in its powers precisely because of the enlightened realization that government is the greatest threat to freedom and liberty. So let me sum up by returning to Adam Smith. You know, F.A. Hayek in his book Individualism and Economic Order has this great little summary of Smith, and he says, look, what Adam Smith was really concerned about when he was talking about his social, economic, and political system was not the assumption that, look, if all people are good, we'll get really good things. It was, can we think about a set of rules such that when the worst person comes to power, they can do the least harm? And he talked about, for instance, markets in that context. What is one of the powerful aspects of markets? If a bad person enters a market, they're still going to act as if they care about you, even if they don't, because that is the only way to earn a profit. It is to satisfy, it is to satiate the wants of consumers. So the institutional rules, the systematic features of markets, incentivize individual participants to act as if they take into account the interests of their fellow human beings, even if they don't. That's what Smith was talking about. David Hume, who I mentioned earlier, another fellow Scottish Enlightenment thinker, he talked about this political maxim of assuming everyone's a knave. He said, look, when we're thinking about political rules, what we want to do is assume that everyone's a knave. And when we assume that everyone's a knave, let's think about what we can do to constrain that knave from doing really bad things if they're in power. This, I want to suggest, is the way that you should think about foreign policy. So, as a citizen of this country, as a voter, as someone that is on the hook for the tens of trillions of dollars in debt, and so on and so forth. Presumably you care about liberty and freedom. When you think about foreign interventions, when you think about foreign policy, what I want to suggest is this. Think about the knave. Think about the political person, either now or historically, that you find the most reprehensible and repulsive. And think about if you would like that person to be in charge, given your proposed policy. Because people are way too comfortable saying something like this. Well, as long as my party's in charge, things are good. But then when the other party gets in power, they get very upset. You hear this all the time. I hear it now. If Trump's elected, I'm leaving the country. Well, that's funny. People are saying when Obama was elected, they were leaving the country, and the world was going to end. But the world doesn't seem to end. What I'm trying to get you to think about is not individuals and not political parties, but systematic features. That is, the incentives created by the system and what kind of incentives they create. Because the power of economics is that it does not require us to make judgments about character type. It requires us instead to focus on the rules and the incentives the rules create. And so what we want to do ideally is to think about rules that incentivize bad people to act as if they're good. And how do you do that? You tie their hands. You don't allow them to have access to the tools that they can use to wield abusive power over citizens. Because, a common response I get to a lot of this is, look, you're so worried about this, but, it's not like the American government's going to collapse tomorrow and an authoritarian despot's going to take over. And I say, you're right. But that's not the concern. I'm not worried about tomorrow. I'm not even worried about the next presidential election. What I'm worried about is the institutional possibilities that are created by granting power now, and how they are used in the future by individuals who we don't know who they'll be. But let's assume it's the worst. Let's have a precautionary principle, precisely because government is our greatest threat. It is the greatest threat to freedom. So if we're going to concentrate significant power in the hands of a group of people, let's think about the limits on that power. And let's think about what would happen in the future if someone extremely undesirable came to power. Thank you very much.
We probably have a few minutes for questions if anybody has any.
Yes, sir.
What would the classical liberal view be of deterrence theory? Because if the issue is, we may not want to intervene in other countries, but we have bad, aggressive actors on the international stage, and we don't want them to be attacking our allies. It seems the only way that we can deter some kind of, say, invasion of Ukraine is to threaten violence if there is some kind of invasion like that.
Yep. So here's what I would say. In terms of deterrence theory, it makes perfect sense, which from an economic standpoint, if you raise the cost of a behavior, people will tend to do less of it. So the idea is that if you build up your military apparatus, it will discourage people from your non-allies from using force. But here's what I would say. The other flip side of that is that the minute you do that, people free ride off you. And the reality of the world is that a significant majority of the world free rides off the United States. And let's unpack who the United States is. It is US taxpayers. So a significant portion of the world free rides off US taxpayers. And I would push back, not on you per se, but in general, and ask yourself, why is the US footing the bill for other people's security? To state it differently, the Ukraine has no long-term implications for the national security of the United States. To the extent the government exists, its role is to protect US citizens. Intervening abroad to be the world's policeman, more often than not, has nothing at all to do with protecting US security interests. In fact, what I want to suggest, to be even more bold, is that there are actually, right now, not talking historically, right now, no real threats to the United States domestically that I can think of. None that we need to be intervening in about 80% of the world, which is what the US intervened in last year. And so, I don't want to speak on behalf of classical liberals. I myself do not consider myself a classical liberal. But I would push back and say, does it really influence the national security of the US? And more often than not, it doesn't. It's simply other people doing it. And then when we talk about allies, it's typically a small group of political elite that have brokered some kind of deal with another political elite. And so that's my position on that. Yep.
One for you. I hope this isn't kind of bringing something else in, but even thinkers like Ayn Rand, right, who normally would kind of agree with most classical liberals on most positions. She makes very strong arguments in support, for example, of the American Civil War. But she makes an argument that when governments are violating the rights of people, it's an obligation to go. I mean, even people like that tend to use these arguments that when governments are violating the rights of their citizens, that somehow it's our responsibility to go in.
Yeah.
And it seems to be these moral arguments about that, and I realize Rand just really didn't understand public choice, and she ignores that in all of her work. But is that really the only, is the answer just at the end of that what I said? I mean, what's this argument about these moral things? Well, it's different if they're in there killing their own citizens. We have to do something to help them.
Yeah. Well, the modern iteration of this, well beyond Ayn Rand, is called the responsibility to protect doctrine, which is actually a moral theory or actually document that says the international community has an obligation to protect citizens when their governments are violating their sovereignty. That sounds nice, but rarely does it happen. And it doesn't happen because of politics. So you try to go through the UN, and of course you need a unanimous vote at the UN Security Council, and someone blocks it all the time because they have some vested interest in their ally or their friend violating the rights of citizens. And so, it's not just Rand, by the way, that's odd about this. Hayek, Mises, Milton Friedman are all very pro-defense. They all say we need government to provide defense, but they just say it. So there's an odd tension there, which is these same individuals realize and make arguments, whether you agree or disagree, they make the argument that government is very bad at performing very basic functions domestically. Yet they seem to grant significant scope for government to engage in defense. And so there's this unresolved tension there, I think, which is something that people that are interested in these things need to think about. Bill.
I mean, a little unfair there.
Very unfair.
The basic argument I think that they're making is that the fundamental role of government is to define and enforce private property rights. And part of that is protecting our private property from foreign intervention.
Yeah. So that's one of the arguments that is made. But I want you to think about something, all right? So people say this kind of thing all the time. Think about the interventions that are undertaken by the United States right now, and think about how many of them actually protect the private property rights of citizens. At most, you could probably name a handful. At most, right? So if you're on board with me with that, that's great. By the way, we're cutting like 85 to 90% of military expenditures then, and military efforts. And so again, that's a very nice way to talk, but rarely do I ever see that being actually enforced in practice. And the flip side, I think, also can be made, which is many interventions actually threaten the security and property of U.S. citizens. In fact, I would argue that most of them do. Most national security efforts have nothing to do with national security. There's other things that drive them in politics, and citizens are an afterthought. This is like a grand myth we've all been indoctrinated into. Do you think that someone is sitting in the Department of Defense right now and saying, every single thing I do is to maximize the national security of the United States? And if you answer yes, by the way, just go look at the contracting process in Iraq and Afghanistan. Is granting $40 million to the Soy Bean Association of the United States so they can build a soybean factory in Iraq, which, by the way, can't grow in the soil there, and no Iraq or Afghanistan, excuse me, Afghanis don't eat soybeans? Is that in the national interest? Is the F-35 fighter jet in the national interest, which is going to turn out to be the most expensive boondoggle in the history of U.S. military procurement? Interestingly, the production is spread across pretty much every U.S. state so that it's too big to fail because people keep pointing out that it doesn't work, that it catches on fire when you try to fly it, that the computers shut down, yet they keep voting to extend the payments to the private contractors that, again, are lining their pockets at the expense of U.S. citizens, and so on down the line. And it's just example after example. So when I hear these kind of things like protect private property rights, they sound nice. They sound very nice, and I wish it was true. I just don't see the empirical evidence to actually back it up in practice, both in the United States, but also through the history of mankind.
But can't you say the same thing about a police force?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, so then what does define and enforce private property rights?
Individuals, right? Individuals. The same reason that I'm sure that when you have a dispute with your neighbor, have historically, you don't call the police or the army every time you do, and you will probably don't punch them in the face. I'm guessing you have some kind of relationship where you talk things through. Now, it's not perfect, Sometimes people do punch each other in the face. But again, if you think about most of our lives, we respect people's private property rights. I walk into Target and Walmart, I pick someone's private property up and I turn around and look at it. I don't walk into your house and do that. I don't look in your house and pick things off the mantle and start going like, how much is this? I respect your private property rights. Do I do that because I'm concerned that you're going to call the police on me? No, I do it because of a complex array of norms and traditions that facilitate social cooperation. So if you actually think about the world, the state, it's in the background. It's not that important in the scheme of things in our daily lives. We walk around and most of us engage in peaceful cooperation. The instances of conflict are exceptions to the rule, not the norm. And if it was, by the way, there wouldn't be enough police if we all started fighting with each other, the police couldn't stop us. There's too many of us.
They can't even stop spring break and
And so that's what I would argue. That's who defines private property rights.
That culture exists within a framework
It does. I
that
agree.
is defined by the existence of a police force.
No, but there's an issue of reverse causality. You can make the argument in both directions. You can make the argument that the state creates property rights. You can also make the argument that property rights need to exist in order to create a government that can be constrained. Right? Because if you don't do that, by the way, then you need to have some romantic conception of the state. That is that a group of individuals step outside the system and create property rights out of some mystical notion of their other regarding behavior.